the secret pact that doomed Europe, new declassified files. The pact that shocked the world. It's late August 1939. In London, telephones buzz through the night. Diplomats in grey suits gather around a wireless set, frozen. The unimaginable has just been confirmed. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin have signed a non-aggression pact. Two sworn enemies, united by paper. For the men at the Foreign Office, it feels like the laws of politics have been suspended. France, on alert but exhausted after Munich, gets the same message minutes later. The sense of disbelief is instant and overwhelming. Germany's greatest ideological foe has suddenly become its partner, and every calculation Britain and France had made to contain the Nazis collapses in a single announcement. Inside the corridors of Whitehall, maps of Europe are spread open. Secretaries rush to verify cables from Berlin and Moscow. Chamberlain's advisors whisper the same question: what's really in that deal? The official communiqué released from Moscow speaks only of peace, mutual respect, and a promise of non-aggression. But seasoned diplomats can sense something deeper, something darker, hiding beneath those polite words. A stunned silence settles over the room before the first words break it. Poland's finished. Across Paris, French newspapers rush to print extra editions. The headlines come out blunt and panicked. Hitler and Stalin join hands. For years, the Soviets had been courted as a possible balance against German expansion. Now, with a single handshake under the chandeliers of the Kremlin, that dream has crumbled. Poland, trapped between the two most ruthless powers in Europe, suddenly faces the nightmare of encirclement. To the outside world, it looks like diplomacy's last line of defense has failed. To insiders, it's worse, a betrayal of logic itself. Communists and fascists, two systems built on mutual hatred, now promising friendship. Can this be real? One British officer scribbles in his notes for the evening briefing. It is, and the implications are catastrophic. Rewind a few weeks, and the atmosphere across Europe was already electric. The Munich Agreement had brought only a year of uneasy calm. Hitler had devoured Czechoslovakia, his eyes now turned toward Poland. The Western Allies, haunted by memories of the Great War, hesitated yet again. In Moscow, Stalin watched these failures and drew one conclusion: he couldn't trust the West to stop Germany. For months, negotiators from Britain and France had tried to pull the Soviet Union into an alliance, but talks moved painfully slow. Distrust choked every discussion. Soviet generals demanded passage through Poland. Polish diplomats refused. Western politicians stalled, promising consultations rather than commitments. And in the background, German envoys whispered to Moscow that Berlin could offer something far more appealing: a guarantee of peace on the Soviet border and a free hand in Eastern Europe. By August, negotiations with the West had effectively died. Stalin had stopped sending senior officials to the meetings. Then word spread quietly through the diplomatic network. A German foreign minister was scheduled to arrive in Moscow for urgent discussions. Some intelligence officers flagged it as a potential shift in Soviet policy. Their memos reached London but were brushed aside, too outlandish to be true. Days later, the unimaginable became real. Joachim von Ribbentrop stepped off a plane beneath the Kremlin's watchtowers, carrying a draft agreement approved personally by Hitler. That night, beneath portraits of Lenin and Tsarist generals alike, signatures were placed on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Cameras were banned. Soviet newspapers printed smiling photographs of Ribbentrop and Molotov exchanging firm handshakes. Behind those smiles, a separate sheet of paper was sealed away, a secret protocol that divided the lands of Eastern Europe like spoils in a game of empire. By dawn on August 24, it wasn't just another treaty. It was the death warrant for interwar diplomacy. Western governments weren't sure what the hidden clause said, but they felt its weight instantly. Within days, Hitler would unleash his armies on Poland, certain that the Red Army wouldn't stand in his way. The headlines told the sanitized story, a pact of peace, but every diplomat in Europe could see what it truly was, a mask for conquest. The alliance no one believed possible had been born, and with it, the countdown to war had begun. The fragile balance before the pact. Spring 1939, Europe stands on a knife's edge. The smoke from Munich hasn't even cleared, yet another storm is building. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain still clings to his hope that appeasement might keep peace intact, a fragile optimism in a continent preparing for war. The ink from the Munich Agreement, which handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler, has barely dried. Hitler has already broken every promise. His forces march into Prague, and the illusion of his limited demands evaporates overnight. But inside Downing Street, the strategy remains the same. Avoid direct confrontation, buy time, and pray that diplomacy still holds sway. Meanwhile in Moscow, Joseph Stalin watches events unfold with cold precision. He's learned his lesson from Munich. Western democracies will betray smaller nations if it buys them peace. The Soviets had offered help to Czechoslovakia, but no Western power backed them. Now Berlin's ambitions are clear, and Stalin knows the Red Army isn't ready for a fight. The recent purges have gutted his officer corps. Over half his senior commanders have been arrested or executed. Despite his outward confidence, Stalin's greatest fear is isolation. His diplomats struggle to find a balance, some kind of security arrangement that will keep Hitler and the West both at bay. By early 1939, British and French negotiators begin discussing a possible alliance with the Soviet Union. On paper, it looks promising. Combine Western industrial strength with Soviet manpower, and Germany could be contained. But mutual suspicion poisons every exchange. Stalin demands the right to move Soviet troops through Poland if Germany attacks. The Poles flatly refuse, terrified that once the Red Army enters, it will never leave. The French hesitate to override Warsaw's objections, and the British, still haunted by their anti-communist fear, avoid any concrete military commitments. Months pass, and the meetings drag on. Every delay deepens Stalin's distrust. In Berlin, Hitler senses the opportunity. His generals remind him that a two-front war had doomed Germany in 1918. This time, they must avoid that at any cost. If Russia could be neutralized, or better yet, briefly befriended, Hitler could strike westward without fear. His foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, begins quietly exploring the idea of reaching out to Moscow. In private sessions with the Führer, he argues that Stalin can be dealt with as a partner of convenience. Ideology, Ribbentrop suggests, is secondary to strategy. Hitler agrees. Plans for conquest can wait until after Poland is crushed. In the Warsaw Foreign Ministry, officials receive scattered reports that German and Soviet intermediaries have renewed contact. They don't want to believe them. Since 1932, Poland has maintained non-aggression pacts with both powers, trusting neither, but hoping those documents might buy time. President Ignacy Masicki and Foreign Minister Joseph Beck face impossible choices. They're surrounded by powers far stronger than their own, and their own allies, Britain and France, remain hesitant to commit troops east of the Rhine. Beck insists Poland will not yield territory or sovereignty, but in his heart, he knows what that means. If war breaks out, Poland will fight alone. Inside British intelligence circles, analysts pick up scraps of diplomatic chatter suggesting that Moscow is softening toward Berlin. Station X in Warsaw intercepts coded commercial messages from Germany to the Soviet trade delegation. At first, the clues seem insignificant, standard negotiations about grain prices and oil exports. But a few observers suspect a deeper agenda. A report dated August 14 warns of increased likelihood of a non-aggression arrangement between the Reich and the USSR. It lands on a mid-level desk in the Foreign Office. No urgency attached. No one wants to admit what the pattern implies. To understand the atmosphere, you have to picture that summer. Governments straining to read each other's moves, every embassy sending contradictory reports. In Paris, Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet tells colleagues that war can still be prevented. In London, Chamberlain's cabinet argues endlessly about guarantees to Poland that have no real military backing. The Royal Navy is under orders to mobilize discreetly, while RAF squadrons begin redeployments along the coast. Everyone senses that Europe's balance is collapsing, yet few grasp how soon the fall will come. At the same moment in the Kremlin, the tone shifts. Stalin replaces cautious rhetoric with deliberate silence. Instead of denouncing German aggression, Soviet newspapers lower their criticism of Berlin. Diplomatic receptions once reserved for Western representatives now welcome German officials. The newspapers call it normalizing relations. To outside observers, it's puzzling. Inside Stalin's mind, it's strategy. He's weighing two offers, one from the West that promises words, another from Germany that promises territory. Meanwhile, on the German side, preparations intensify for the invasion of Poland. Wehrmacht officers mark railway junctions and river crossings on secret maps. The timing depends on one question: will the Soviets interfere? Ribbentrop sends signals to Moscow through back channels, offering economic incentives and a guarantee of neutrality. He claims Germany recognizes Soviet interests in the Baltics and Bessarabia. Such phrases carry meaning, implicit territorial rights. Stalin listens. The idea of carving Eastern Europe into zones of influence isn't new. Imperial powers had done it for centuries, but the prospect of doing it between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, a collision of two totalitarian empires, defies moral comprehension. To Stalin, though, morality is irrelevant. He's convinced the West hopes to push Hitler eastward, letting the fascists and communists destroy each other while London stays safe behind the Channel. They want to trick us into fighting their war, he tells Molotov, his foreign minister. Let them bleed first. By mid-August, the Western mission to Moscow is all but finished. The French delegates fly home empty-handed, while the British envoys remain stuck waiting for signatures that never come. Their instructions from London are timid, filled with vague assurances, but no military timetable. Stalin notices. When the talks with the West drag into another week without progress, he sends Molotov a blunt order: open the door to Berlin. Inside the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the mood becomes electric. Messages coded in diplomatic cipher fly between Moscow and Berlin. On August 19, Germany and the USSR sign a commercial agreement, the perfect cover for deeper negotiations. Grain, oil, and steel quotas fill the official documents, but the real discussion is about what comes next. Molotov telegraphs Ribbentrop. Negotiations possible at the highest level. Time is short. The following day, British intelligence intercepts radio chatter between Berlin and Moscow, hinting at an upcoming diplomatic visit. A few officers recognize the risk. They send an urgent note to Whitehall warning that Hitler may try to secure Stalin's neutrality. The memo arrives, but gets buried under a pile of reports labeled speculative. Chamberlain's cabinet doesn't want another alarmist theory the week before recess. In hindsight, that single dismissal marks the last missed chance to counter what's coming. As Europe moves through its final days of false peace, everything hangs on Stalin's decision. Will he side with the Western Allies, believing their pledges, or gamble on a temporary truce with Nazi Germany? For him, the answer lies in calculation, not ideology. The Soviets have suffered humiliation since Munich. Now, Stalin intends to be the one dealing humiliation back. He tells his close circle that Russia must never fight on two fronts again. If a written guarantee from Hitler can buy 18 months of breathing room, so be it. And so, Europe balances on a narrow ridge, pretending diplomacy still matters while the new war machinery roars to life beneath the surface. Poland waits in nervous silence, France debates in denial, and Britain preaches resilience it doesn't yet feel. The next move belongs to Moscow. In a matter of days, that move will make history. Inside the negotiations, Moscow, August 1939. August 23, 1939. A German plane descends toward Moscow under grey, heavy sky. On board sits Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, clutching two documents: Hitler's personal authorization for a non-aggression pact and a second paper far more dangerous, a secret map dividing the east of Europe. As the wheels touch the tarmac, Soviet officers in formal coats stand waiting, their faces unreadable. The order from Stalin is clear: treat the Germans like honored guests. At the Kremlin, preparations run with military precision. Flowers line the hallways, tables are set with crystal, and translators rehearse key phrases so not a syllable is lost in misinterpretation. Beneath the glitter, tension crackles. Everyone in the building knows this is no normal diplomatic visit. It's a meeting between two predators calculating how to share the hunt. When Ribbentrop steps inside, Vyacheslav Molotov greets him with a stiff handshake. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Ribbentrop, polished and fanatically convinced of Nazi destiny. Molotov, cautious, bureaucratic, playing the part of loyal executor to Stalin's will. Small talk fills the first minutes. Trade, mutual respect, vague remarks about European peace. Then the real conversation begins. Stalin joins them shortly after midnight. He doesn't waste words. He knows Ribbentrop has come with an offer that could transform his position overnight. Germany desires friendship, the German begins, sliding his case onto the table. He describes the pact as purely defensive, a guarantee that neither side will attack the other. Stalin nods, expression fixed, revealing nothing. After a pause, he asks the question that matters. What about Poland? That's the signal. Molotov unrolls a map of Eastern Europe. Lines are drawn, pencils tracing borders that millions of people don't yet know will decide their fate. The Germans propose a division, Poland split along the Neo, Vistula, and San rivers. The Baltic states fall under Soviet interest, except for Lithuania, which Germany claims due to its proximity to East Prussia. Stalin studies the boundaries like a man reviewing blueprints, not human lives. He makes a few adjustments, pushing the Soviet lines slightly westward toward the Curzon frontier. For strategic depth, he says calmly. Ribbentrop hesitates, knowing Hitler expects quick agreement, then nods. Within hours, they reach understanding. The Soviet Union gains influence over Estonia, Latvia, Finland, and parts of Romania. Germany takes western Poland and Lithuania. What's left of Poland, barely a corridor of land, is marked for destruction. The secret protocol is typed up immediately, 2 copies prepared. Both men sign without ceremony. Outside, the Kremlin bells mark the midnight hour. Inside, Europe's map has just been rewritten in silence. Ribbentrop's mission, however, isn't just about signatures. He must also convince Stalin that Berlin's intentions are trustworthy. So he offers flattery. He praises Soviet discipline, calls Stalin the leader who understands the world's realities. Molotov responds with equal caution. If Germany guarantees Soviet security, we see no obstacle to closer cooperation. Beneath the politeness, each side measures the other's weakness. For Stalin, the decision is cold arithmetic. The Red Army, still recovering from the purges, isn't ready for a major war. His intelligence reports describe Germany's rearmament in chilling detail: modern tanks, coordinated air tactics, formidable logistics. He's convinced he needs at least another 2 years before the USSR can face Germany directly. A pact with Hitler will buy that time. It's a wager that Germany will fight the West first, giving the Soviets a window to prepare. If Hitler keeps his word, the USSR gains territory. If he doesn't, Stalin at least pushes his frontier westward, giving him distance to fight on Soviet terms. Ribbentrop reads the confidence wrong. He believes Stalin's enthusiasm is genuine, that the Soviets admire Nazi efficiency. He sends coded telegrams to Berlin the very night, claiming the meeting proceeded in a spirit of mutual understanding. Hitler receives the message and celebrates. The pact means Poland can now be invaded without fear of a Soviet response. His generals begin finalizing the timetable for September 1. Back in Moscow, the negotiations move to logistics. Economic clauses are added. The Soviets will provide grain, oil, and metals to Germany. Germany will supply machinery and weapons technology. It's the start of a transactional relationship built entirely on deceit. The room smells of tobacco and exhaustion. Translators yawn into their sleeves as the documents are copied in duplicate. Stalin pours champagne, famously toasting to the future of German-Soviet friendship. Ribbentrop raises his glass, beaming. The interpreter hesitates, translating the words. Friendship sounds absurd even here, but Stalin waves him on. Say it exactly as spoken. As dawn approaches, Ribbentrop's aides prepare to depart. The signed documents are locked in a briefcase with crimson wax seals. Outside, reporters gather, unaware of what's really been agreed. The official statement released to the press mentions only a non-aggression treaty aimed at ensuring peace between the Soviet Union and Germany. No one outside the Kremlin sees the secret annex, though whispers spread almost instantly among Western attachés. One rumor claims Poland will be partitioned. Another insists it's just a trade arrangement. Moscow denies all of them. At 8 in the morning, the Germans leave the Kremlin for a tour of the city. Ribbentrop, still elated, sends one more cable to Berlin claiming Stalin laughed at Western diplomacy, calling it worthless chatter. The remark flatters Hitler immensely. He orders Ribbentrop to offer the Soviets a congratulatory note of friendship from himself personally. Inside the Kremlin's private study, after the Germans depart, Stalin sits with Molotov reviewing the maps again. The bourgeois will fight among themselves, he says quietly. We'll come in later to collect. Molotov agrees, though uneasily. He knows the implications. Two totalitarian empires have just formalized a marriage of convenience built on lies. Neither intends to keep it for long. Later that evening, as radio operators relay the public news, the world learns only half the story. The German broadcast celebrates a new era of cooperation. Soviet media echo the phrasing, describing the event as an act of peace-loving states. But diplomats from the Baltic embassies in Moscow understand its real meaning instantly. They begin wiring home-coded warnings. Prepare for territorial adjustments. Their governments can't believe it. They've signed treaties with the USSR promising mutual respect. Within months, those promises will vanish. The secrecy is nearly perfect. Only a handful of people in Moscow know that a supplemental agreement exists. The document is hidden in an envelope marked Special File Number 1, locked in Stalin's personal archive. Years later, even Soviet historians will deny its existence, calling it a Western fabrication. Yet for now, Stalin is confident no truth will leak. To him, deception is just another weapon. The photo distributed that day shows smiling men standing under the Kremlin chandelier. Ribbentrop in his immaculate uniform, Molotov with his stoic smirk, Stalin oddly relaxed between them. The image is meant to project stability. In reality, it captures the world seconds before collapse. By the time Ribbentrop's aircraft lifts off from Moscow, the ink is dry and history set in motion. Stalin's immediate order to his generals is short and precise. Avoid provocations. Prepare for potential reorganization of our western frontier. In Berlin, Hitler reads the confirmation aloud to his staff, declaring, "Now Poland is ours." Neither dictator knows it yet, but they've just built an alliance destined to self-destruct. For the moment, both believe they've outsmarted the other. Beneath the marble halls of the Kremlin, the lamps flicker out, leaving behind the scent of smoke and champagne, and the quiet echo of a deal that has just sealed Europe's fate. The secret protocols, the carving up of Europe. Behind the elegant handshakes and photo opportunities of August 23, 1939, a far darker document was being drafted in the shadows. While headlines around the world spoke of a non-aggression pact, a second agreement, an annex written in precise, bureaucratic language, outlined nothing less than the dismantling of Eastern Europe. On that hidden page, nations became bargaining chips, their fates decided in pencil strokes and signatures exchanged over champagne. This annex, later known as the Secret Protocol, was blunt and devoid of sentiment. It divided the lands lying between Germany and the Soviet Union into spheres of influence. To historians, those words would come to define the erasure of several countries from the map. To Stalin and Hitler, it was the ultimate expression of realpolitik, an orderly plan for conquest disguised beneath diplomatic civility. The first victim designated was Poland. Its eastern half, from the Neo to the San rivers, fell into the Soviet sphere. The western portion went to Germany. The line drawn across that nation wasn't just geographic, it was surgical. Cities, rivers, forests, and millions of lives were cut apart. Each power promised that, when the time came, their armies would advance to their respective borders and stop, leaving the rest to occupation and silence. Next came the Baltic states. Estonia and Latvia were assigned to the Soviet sphere without hesitation. Germany, with no pressing interest in those territories, conceded easily. Lithuania proved trickier. It had deep ties to East Prussia and a small but strategic coastline coveted by Berlin. The two sides haggled like merchants dividing spoils. Initial drafts gave Lithuania to Germany. Later revisions transferred most of it back to the Soviet side, except for a narrow German corridor near Memel. To the people of those nations, unaware of any agreement, life carried on in a fragile summer peace. Within months, Soviet and German armies would arrive, claiming territories their governments didn't know had already been sold. Finland was also included in Stalin's share. The justification was security considerations near Leningrad, but the intent was expansion. Stalin viewed the small northern democracy as both a buffer and a future target. Further south, the Soviet sphere extended into Bessarabia, then part of Romania, marking another planned assault on Europe's borders. By contrast, Hitler's conquests were focused westward. He wanted the industrial basins of Poland and free access to the Baltic coast to fuel his next campaign, France. In dividing the map, each dictator prepared for war in his own direction, temporarily satisfied that the other would not interfere. For Stalin, the pact was a triumph of cunning. The Soviet leader had maneuvered himself into a position where he could expand without firing a shot. His orders to the Red Army emphasized readiness, mobilize quietly, anticipate border changes, avoid provocations. He assured his generals that the agreement would secure peace, while giving the USSR freedom to act when opportunity demanded. They understood his meaning. Peace was temporary, expansion inevitable. Inside Germany, the protocol was treated as one of the regime's most closely guarded secrets. Only a handful of Nazi officials saw the actual document. Hitler feared that revealing it might shatter public faith in his anti-communist crusade. To his followers, he continued speaking of Bolshevism as a plague. Privately, he boasted that Stalin had granted him Poland. Ribbentrop, proud of his diplomatic victory, distributed strict orders that no reference to territorial division be made in any communication. Even within the Wehrmacht, most officers believed the Soviet Union would remain neutral rather than cooperative. They wouldn't discover the truth until the Red Army marched eastward 17 days after Germany invaded from the west. On the Soviet side, secrecy was even more absolute. The signed protocol was stored under lock and key in Stalin's personal archive. Only Molotov, his deputy, and a handful of aides knew of its existence. Soviet propaganda immediately portrayed the pact as a defensive measure aimed at preserving peace. Newspapers described Western critics as warmongers spreading false interpretations. To ensure discipline, Stalin ordered the NKVD to monitor foreign journalists and suppress rumors that the USSR had negotiated territorial gains. Even members of the Politburo were denied access to the text. When one senior official asked about the Baltic region's future, Molotov replied coldly, "Comrade Stalin will determine borders in due course." While the public face of diplomacy smiled, events on the ground began aligning with the map inside Stalin's vault. Soviet border troops repositioned closer to Poland. Transport units received coded instructions identifying new staging areas. The German army undertook similar measures. Railway lines were secured, bridges reinforced, fuel stockpiled along the frontier. Both sides acted as if a script already existed, and in truth, it did. The scale of cynicism was breathtaking. Two ideologically opposed regimes, claiming to defend the people from foreign exploitation, now divided them for mutual convenience. Communist and fascist propaganda machines told their citizens opposite stories that led to the same lie, that peace had been preserved. In Berlin, speeches praised the stabilizing wisdom of the Führer. In Moscow, Pravda declared that capitalism's attempts to isolate the USSR had failed. Each audience applauded, unaware that their rulers were plotting identical crimes from opposite ends of the continent. By early September, after Germany's invasion of Poland, the clauses of the secret protocol began taking effect in blood. As Wehrmacht divisions swept through Warsaw and Krakow, Stalin waited, counting the days until Germany's promised demarcation line. Once Polish resistance collapsed in the west, Soviet troops marched from the east under the pretext of protecting minorities. In reality, they were fulfilling an agreed boundary. For the first and only time, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union acted as de facto allies on the battlefield. Soviet and German officers met along rough village roads to coordinate withdrawals and advances. Photographs show them smiling, sharing cigarettes, even arranging small parades celebrating victory over Poland. To both sides, borders were temporary checkpoints in a grander design. The Polish government fell, and the country disappeared, half swallowed by the swastika, half by the hammer and sickle. This moment marked the purest expression of the secret protocol's purpose, to transform written abstraction into occupied reality. The partition of Poland wasn't an accident of war. It was a scheduled handover, executed with mechanical precision. Meanwhile, propaganda on both sides continued disguising the truth. German media declared Soviet movements a spontaneous measure to restore order. Soviet broadcasts called the German invasion a defensive response to Polish aggression. The absurdity didn't matter. The map was all that counted. Over the next year, further clauses unfolded. The USSR pressured Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into signing mutual assistance treaties, then occupied them entirely by mid-194. Each event mirrored the August document line for line. Soviet propaganda claimed voluntary accession. Internal memos described absorption according to prior understanding. In Bessarabia, Soviet troops crossed the Prut River while Germany observed without protest, another predetermined act under the Hidden Accord. For every advance east or west, populations were displaced, deported, or executed under new rulers who considered them collateral. The irony could hardly be greater. Nazi slogans condemned Bolshevism as humanity's poison. Soviet propaganda depicted fascism as capitalism's final horror. Yet between them, they constructed a geographic partnership that eliminated every small democracy from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The secret protocol had turned their ideological conflict into a joint enterprise of empire. Neither dictator saw contradiction, only opportunity. Hitler viewed the pact as tactical, an instrument to isolate Britain and France while securing resources from the east. Stalin saw it as insurance. Each man believed he controlled the pace of events. When they toasted in the Kremlin, they weren't celebrating trust, but temporary convenience. Even so, the deception couldn't last forever. Western intelligence soon received detailed reports from captured correspondents and refugee testimonies hinting at a territorial division. British analysts began sketching reconstructed maps, noting uncanny parallels with actual Soviet troop movements. By 194, the pattern was undeniable. Yet officially, both Germany and the Soviet Union insisted no secret treaty existed. They would maintain that lie for half a century. The hidden annex reshaped not only borders, but the very framework of global war. It enabled Germany's Blitzkrieg to begin without fear of Eastern resistance, allowed the USSR to expand under facade of peace, and condemned millions to occupation before the first Western shot was fired. The document's language, dry, technical, stripped of emotion, hid the scale of devastation it unleashed. What began as penciled lines on Stalin's desk became a continental tragedy etched in blood. Towns divided, families scattered, governments erased, all predetermined before a single soldier moved. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were less an agreement than an arithmetic of conquest. They taught the world a grim lesson about power stripped of morality, that before war comes the mapmaker, and by the time the map is redrawn, the fighting has already been decided. Western reaction, disbelief and panic. The news reached London before dawn. In the Foreign Office, lights flicked on across Whitehall as exhausted clerks rushed telegrams upstairs. Germany and the Soviet Union have concluded a non-aggression agreement. The sentence was so improbable that one official reread it 3 times before carrying it to the Cabinet Office. Neville Chamberlain, roused from sleep, was described as grave yet incredulous. For months, he'd gambled that Stalin might still join an anti-Hitler coalition. Now, with a single signature, that hope lay in ruins. In the city's cafes and underground stations, newspapers sold out within minutes. Hitler and Stalin make peace. the headlines blared. To ordinary Britons still haunted by images of Munich, it felt like history repeating, only far worse. Members of Parliament arriving at Westminster that morning spoke in stunned half-sentences. One senior Conservative muttered, "The world's gone mad." The Labour benches seethed. Their members had pleaded for a firm stand against fascism. Now both fascists and communists were seemingly united, while Britain hesitated. Across the Channel, France reacted no differently. Just months earlier, diplomats in Paris had been trudging through endless negotiations with Stalin's envoys, promising mutual security. French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet received the Moscow announcement with what aides called a paralysis of disbelief. The alliance system France had relied upon since Versailles, Poland to the east, Britain to the north, possibly Russia as a counterweight, had collapsed overnight. Prime Minister Édouard Daladier called an emergency cabinet meeting, his voice tight with anger. "We are alone now," he said flatly, staring at the map of Europe pinned to the wall. Behind these political reactions came the urgent scramble of intelligence. The British Secret Intelligence Service, still recovering from its earlier misjudgments, dispatched frantic requests to embassies in Berlin, Warsaw, and Riga. What exactly had been agreed? The public statement from Moscow sounded routine, mere talk of friendship and mutual respect, but insiders suspected a hidden clause. Fragments of information filtered in within hours. German railway timetables accelerating toward the Polish frontier, Soviet troop redeployments along the Dnieper. Patterns emerged that looked too deliberate to dismiss. One intelligence officer scribbled a single line across his notebook: Partition. Inside the War Office, generals reviewed defense plans that suddenly seemed irrelevant. The assumption that the USSR would pressure Germany from the east was gone. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding commented quietly that the entire European balance had rotated on its axis. Reports flowed from Poland, insisting its government was shaken but defiant. Warsaw's ambassador in London urged Britain to confirm its guarantees immediately. "The Polish people will fight," he warned, "but they cannot fight Germany and Russia at once." It sounded alarmist, yet within weeks those words would prove prophetic. Public outrage followed almost instantly. Parliamentarians demanded explanations. The press gave them fury instead. The Daily Express called the pact an act of monumental cynicism. Editorials across Europe echoed the sentiment of betrayal. For socialists, it was ideological whiplash. How could Stalin, the supposed guardian of anti-fascism, embrace Hitler? For conservatives, it was confirmation that communism and fascism were interchangeable evils. Crowds gathered outside the Soviet embassy in London, some burning effigies of the two dictators side by side. At Downing Street, Chamberlain met his ministers that evening in tense session. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, admitted that intelligence had hinted at German-Soviet contacts, but not at a final agreement. The Prime Minister, normally calm to the point of detachment, grew uncharacteristically animated. "Hitler thinks he's tricked us," he snapped, "but events may yet rebound upon him." Still, there was no clear plan of action. Britain's rearmament was incomplete, the Royal Air Force still modernizing, and the public still wary of another continental war. Chamberlain's instinct was to delay. That caution, though, now looked like paralysis. Meanwhile, Paris was gripped by rising panic. French intelligence reported that German troops were massing near the Polish border, well ahead of any declared mobilization. Daladier issued an appeal for unity, while privately confessing to advisors that his nation's defensive line might hold only months. The Maginot Forts, once symbols of safety, suddenly felt like tombs waiting for occupants. "If the Russians stand with Germany," one general whispered, "we are finished." Within this chaos, one voice in Britain seemed eerily composed: Winston Churchill, still a backbench MP, but already famous for warning that appeasement would fail. That afternoon, he wrote to a colleague, calling the pact a tragedy born of folly. In private, he was more blunt. "Stalin has chosen the Scorpion as partner. They will sting each other soon enough, but others will die first." To Churchill, the pact didn't contradict his predictions, it confirmed them. When reporters asked for comment, he limited himself to a single phrase: "The lights are going out across Europe once again." By late August, diplomatic traffic surged at a pace unseen since 1914. British and French ambassadors to Warsaw pressed for details about Poland's readiness. The Poles, grim and determined, announced a general mobilization. Their intelligence believed Hitler would invade within days. Yet the crucial question remained: would the Soviet Union act? Warsaw's military attaché warned London that Soviet radio channels had shifted to coded wartime frequencies. It was the first sign that Moscow wasn't merely neutral, but preparing for its own move. The confusion spread to Washington. American diplomats, still observing neutrality, found themselves bombarded by European envoys desperate for insight. President Roosevelt sent cautious messages urging restraint, but privately, the State Department concluded that war was now inevitable. One briefing note captured the hopeless mood spreading through embassies. All negotiations are now vanity. Hitler and Stalin have divided the chessboard. In Britain, newspapers printed speculative maps showing possible divisions of Poland, though none guessed the exact lines. Cartoonists filled front pages, Stalin and Hitler carving a roast labeled Europe. The humor barely concealed fear. Air raid drills resumed. City workers painted blackout markings on windows. The word spreading through government corridors was simple and terrifying, unavoidable. Even the most optimistic officials conceded that Germany, freed from Eastern risk, could now strike west with impunity. On August 25, Chamberlain took the final step. A formal alliance guaranteeing Poland's independence was signed with France's support. The act was both symbolic and desperate, a promise given when help was likely impossible. Telegrams shot eastward warning Warsaw that German invasion was imminent. Poland's ambassador thanked them politely, fully aware that no British soldier could reach his country in time. Across Europe's capitals that night, silence replaced diplomacy. The pact in Moscow had redrawn every assumption built since the Great War. Small nations like Finland, Estonia, and Latvia suddenly saw their names whispered in foreign ministries as zones of interest. Turkey began reinforcing its frontiers. Romania sought British aid, sensing that Bessarabia was already on someone's secret list. Britain's MI6 chief later wrote that those August days felt like staring through glass at an approaching disaster you are powerless to prevent. As dawn rose over London on August 31, tension reached its peak. Military orders were sealed, air raid sirens tested, evacuation plans prepared. In Parliament, Chamberlain delivered a restrained but fatalistic address. Britain desired peace, but would meet her obligations. Outside, people stood in the drizzle reading bulletins as radio announcers confirmed heavy activity on the German-Polish border. The Foreign Office clock struck midnight, and still no reply came from Berlin's embassy to Britain's final plea for restraint. Churchill wrote that night in his diary, "Two dictators have sealed the death warrant of Europe, and we must now face the execution." When reports the next morning confirmed German invasion, no one looked surprised, only hollow. 17 days later, the Red Army crossed from the east, proving every suspicion correct. Watching from London, diplomats traded the final words for which history would remember that summer. So it begins. The fall of Poland, the Pact in action. September 1, 1939, at 4:45 a.m. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Westerplatte garrison in Gdansk. Seconds later, German aircraft appear over Poland in waves. Columns of armor pour across the border at breakneck speed. The word Blitzkrieg, lightning war, suddenly has meaning. Within hours, communications between Polish divisions collapse. Rail lines are bombed, bridges detonated. Soldiers on bicycles try to outrun Stukas that scream down on country roads. From Warsaw to Lodz, the sky burns. British and French leaders follow events from telegrams and radio reports. They stand by their guarantee to Poland, yet their armies remain far to the west, bound by logistics and the illusion of time. Chamberlain's ultimatum to Hitler expires on September 3. When no reply came, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Europe has crossed the line from crisis to catastrophe. But for Poland, the war was already lost on the maps drawn 10 days earlier in Moscow. Polish defense plans, Operation Zachod, were built on the assumption of holding the German advance until Western offensives began. The Soviet Union, bound by a non-aggression pact with Poland since 1932, was expected to remain neutral. Commanders along the eastern frontier received routine orders to avoid provoking their friendly neighbor. That illusion would prove fatal. In the west, German armored divisions sliced through the Polish corridor and Upper Silesia. Panzer units led by Heinz Guderian race ahead of the infantry, encircling entire corps before they can retreat. Luftwaffe bombers destroy not only military targets, but also rail stations, refugee columns, and city centers to break civilian morale. German documents call it shock by speed. Witnesses call it terror. By September 7, Poland's front line is shattered. General Bortnowski's Pomor's army is isolated. Krakow falls the next day. Civilians flee eastward, believing the Soviet border means safety. They don't know Stalin has already marked that region as his own in the secret protocol. In Berlin, Hitler boasts to his staff that Stalin keeps his word. German logistics officers reported that trainloads of Soviet oil had already crossed the frontier from the August trade agreement, fuel that now powers the same tanks rolling into Warsaw. By September 10, the Wehrmacht had cut through central Poland and was closing on the capital. Still, Polish resistance is stubborn. At Wisna, 720 soldiers hold off 40,000 Germans for 3 days before being overrun. The battle earns the title, the Polish Thermopylae. Yet while the world expects German aggression, what happens next stuns even veteran observers. In Moscow, Stalin waits patiently for Germany to do the dirty work. The moment Warsaw is encircled, he makes his move. It's pre-dawn on September 17 when Soviet forces cross the Polish border along a 1,000-mile front. No declaration of war, just a statement read over Moscow radio. The Polish state has ceased to exist. The Red Army is entering to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian brothers. A Polish unit still fighting Germans, the announcement is incomprehensible. General Rids Smigly issues the order: do not engage the Soviets unless attacked. Within hours, they are attacked everywhere. From Vilnius to Lwów, columns of T-26 tanks advance behind artillery barrages. Villages wave white cloth hoping for mercy. Some are fired on anyway. German radio welcomes the Soviet entry as support for order in the east. At Brest-Litovsk, German and Soviet forces literally meet on the highway. Accounts describe Major Heinz Guderian and Soviet Commander Semyon Krivoshin shaking hands, reviewing a joint parade beneath banners of both powers. A German brass band plays while Soviet tanks roll by. The photographs circulated through embassies shock even seasoned diplomats, proof that the two dictators are now coordinating to erase a nation. Inside Poland, chaos turns to despair. Government officials flee toward Romania hoping to form a government in exile. Civilian ministries burn archives to keep them from Soviet hands. As refugees move south, German and Soviet aircraft sometimes share the same skies, attacking separate targets but never each other. A bizarre ballet of coordination born out of the secret map. Both occupiers act swiftly to obliterate Poland's identity. The Wehrmacht hands civil administration to the SS, who begin executing intellectuals and community leaders. Operation Tannenberg targets professors, priests, and veterans, the people capable of leading resistance. To the east, the NKVD follows its own list: officers, police, families, politicians. Tens of thousands are deported to labor camps in Siberia. At Katyn, 3 years later, the remains of many of these prisoners will be found with Soviet bullets in their skulls. That crime traces its origin to the September when Stalin claimed his half of Poland. The division line runs close to its secretly agreed boundary, along the Bug River through Brzesk, and south toward the Carpathians. German officers hand over villages to their Soviet counterparts according to carefully typed schedules. Local Poles, forced to watch the ceremony, call them paper funerals. Meanwhile, Britain and France can only issue protests. Their armies sit on the Western Front in a strange silence later nicknamed the Phony War. Propaganda in London promises aid to Poland, but there is no practical way to deliver it. For Warsaw's defenders, those words arrive as cruel irony. They fight alone for the next 3 weeks. On September 27, after a relentless siege and 10 days without water, Warsaw capitulates. More than 20,000 civilians are killed in the bombing. Polish radio's last broadcast is a violin solo of the national anthem, cut off mid-note as power fails. Western audiences learn of the Soviet invasion only belatedly. Initial reports call it a rumor or a limited border action. When confirmation arrives, editorials search for rationale. Some commentators assume Stalin entered to stop German advance, not realizing the operation was coordinated weeks in advance. In Parliament, a few voices urge declaring war on the USSR as well. The cabinet rejects it. Britain can't fight 2 wars at once. That decision saves Moscow from immediate hostility and cements its new position as unspoken partner in German aggression. Inside Germany, state media praises the Red Army's actions as restoration of ethnic order in the East. In Moscow, Pravda declares the Polish government a fascist puppet of imperialists. The double narrative works. For now, citizens in both countries believe their side has acted defensively. Only diplomats and intelligence officers recognize the precision of the plan. On September 28, Molotov and Ribbentrop sign another treaty in Moscow confirming the partition. Lithuania is shifted to Soviet control in exchange for minor border corrections, proof that even as Poland dies, its corpse is still being bargained over. For the Polish people, occupation means erasure. Street names change overnight. School books are rewritten to deny their statehood. Thousands flee south through the Tatras into Hungary, forming the core of future exile forces that will fight in France and later Britain. But the country itself vanishes from maps. Foreign offices update atlases showing Germany and the USSR now meeting at a shared border, just as the secret protocol intended. Amid the ruins of Warsaw, German troops march in triumph. Film crews record propaganda reels of order and cleanliness restored. In the occupied East, Soviet commissars staged their own parades, handing out coupons for the bread station and calling it liberation. For ordinary Poles, both flags feel the same, foreign colors over a land carved apart. October 6 marks the official end of the campaign. German reports call it a model operation of modern warfare. Soviet memos celebrate the return of historically lost lands. Neither mentions the hundreds of thousands of refugees, the destroyed villages, the executions already underway. The pact's promises have been fulfilled exactly. Paper borders become scar lines across Europe. Behind the statistics lie quiet human scenes. A Polish pilot takes off from Romania in an old biplane, carrying the nation's gold reserves to France. A farmer near Bialystok buries his uniform when Soviets arrive, only to be arrested 2 days later for concealing weapons. At a train station in Lvov, a Soviet officer uses a German-issued map to allocate cargo cars, both armies using identical coordinates. Each moment is a fragment of collaboration unthinkable months earlier. By year's end, Poland has ceased to exist. The Germans integrate their zone into the Reich as general government. The Soviets attach their portion to Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet republics. Borders are sealed, telegrams censored, histories rewritten. For those who survive, the lesson is mercilessly clear. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't a political agreement, but a blueprint for obliteration. When winter comes, the Vistula is choked with ice and wreckage, and Europe is officially at war. In Berlin, Hitler tells his generals the campaign proved Germany unstoppable. In Moscow, Stalin toasts Molotov for a job well done. No one mentions the millions caught between them. The pact's currency has been paid in blood, and the two dictators stand momentarily rich on the profits of a nation destroyed. Cooperation in the shadows, the Soviet-German partnership. In public, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact looked like a brief handshake between uneasy neighbors. In private, it became an engine of cooperation that kept Germany's war machine running. What followed after the ink dried wasn't a mere truce. It was an exchange of lifeblood. Stalin sent the fuel, grain, and minerals. Hitler sent machinery, aircraft parts, and blueprints. Each knew the partnership couldn't last, yet both poured energy into it as if permanence could be bought with railcars. The first trainloads rolled across the border within weeks of Poland's partition. Soviet oil storage tanks in Borislav and Grozny began pumping west. In exchange, German workshops crated up turbines, locomotives, and even components of naval guns destined for Leningrad shipyards. Official communiques described the deal as a standard trade arrangement, but the numbers told another story. Between late 1939 and 1941, over 1 million tons of grain and nearly 1 million tons of fuel moved east to west. Soviet factories received modern German machinery. German forces received the resources to keep their tanks rolling through France. On both sides of the frontier, delegations worked in total secrecy. German technicians arrived under false commercial identities to inspect Soviet ports. NKVD agents shadowed them the entire time. In Murmansk, workers watched as German cruisers quietly docked at a new facility called Basis Nord. Officially, it was a supply depot. In reality, it was a Soviet-granted submarine base, offering the Kriegsmarine a refueling stop far beyond the reach of the Royal Navy. Few outside Stalin's inner circle knew it existed. By the winter of 1939, the partnership was running at full tilt. Tankers steamed from Batumi laden with oil while convoys of freight cars crossed Belarus carrying ore, cotton, and wood. German economists marveled at the efficiency. Without Russian supplies, our stocks would be exhausted in months, one report read. Inside the Soviet Politburo, the tone was grimmer. Molotov reminded his staff that every shipment was temporary, a means to an end. He assured Stalin that Germany was paying in technology that could be turned against them later. To both men, the pact functioned as a mirror. Each side saw only its own advantage reflected. Then came the military exchanges. Within the first months of 194, German cargo ships delivered samples of 30 modern warplanes to the Soviet Union. Bf-109 fighters, Ju-88 bombers, and the new Bf-110 twin-engine interceptor. Soviet engineers disassembled each piece for study, copying everything from fuel injection systems to armor plating designs. Germany even transferred the incomplete heavy cruiser Lutzow, towed half-built to Leningrad, where it became the Soviet Petropavlovsk. Blueprints for the battleship Bismarck were hand-carried by German officers on sealed trains. Each delivery came with strict orders. No publicity, no ceremony, no traceable paper trail. For Hitler, these transfers were a small price. What mattered were the rivers of fuel feeding his campaigns. When German armored divisions roared across France in May 194, their tanks burned Soviet diesel. Their mess halls served Soviet grain. Berlin bureaucrats called it the Eastern Import Program. British intelligence called it what it was, lifeline. Churchill knew the irony. The Soviets, nominally opposed to fascism, were feeding the beast that would eventually devour them. Yet from Stalin's perspective, the arrangement was strategically elegant. Every month of peace was another month of rearmament. The Red Army was being rebuilt. Aircraft production was rising steadily after the purges. German technical data accelerated Soviet projects in aviation and naval gunnery. Soviet engineers tested armors copied from German designs on the T-34 prototype. The NKVD's foreign branch began purchasing German optics and radios under the guise of trade instruments. To outsiders, the USSR looked cooperative. Inside, it was stealing time as deliberately as it stole technology. In Berlin, not everyone trusted this pact of mutual expedience. Army officers resented sending high-grade equipment to a potential enemy. The Navy complained that Basis Nord was too exposed and brought little return. But Hitler silenced dissent with bluster. He insisted that Stalin was firmly under his thumb, a peasant who respects strength. Privately, he had already ordered his general staff to draft contingency plans for an eastern offensive. Even as Soviet oil filled German barrels, maps marked Operation Barbarossa took shape. Meanwhile, propaganda in both capitals performed an awkward dance. Nazi papers toned down anti-Bolshevik rhetoric overnight. Soviet press suddenly found new respect for German peace initiatives. Cartoonists were instructed to avoid depicting Hitler at all. Even Comintern movements outside the USSR received orders to re-evaluate imperialist contradictions, a polite way of telling foreign communists to stop criticizing Germany. Stalin enforced the line with brutal consistency. When a Soviet journalist in Paris published an article hinting that Nazi Germany remained the aggressor, he was recalled and disappeared into the Lubyanka. By spring 194, the relationship looked stable from the outside, yet cracks were forming. German officials complained that Soviet shipments arrived slowly through Baltic ports clogged with ice. Soviet traders protested that Germany was failing to deliver promised machines. Each suspected the other of cheating. The imbalance was obvious. By the end of 194, the USSR had sent goods worth 190 million Reichsmarks. Germany had returned only half that value. Behind diplomatic smiles, resentment grew. One scene illustrates the tension. In June 194, as German forces paraded through Paris, Soviet Ambassador Vladimir Dekhanozov hosted a reception in Berlin. Wehrmacht officers toasted German-Soviet friendship beneath banners of both flags. Only hours later, Molotov sent instructions to prepare demands on Bessarabia, Romania, territory clearly within the Soviet sphere under the secret protocol. Stalin wanted to see whether Hitler would object. He did not, too consumed with Western victories. The Red Army moved in without resistance, tightening Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe to Moscow, that proved the pact still served its purpose. But as Germany's conquests expanded, Stalin's anxiety deepened. He watched the speed at which France collapsed and wondered when that momentum would turn east. He ordered new territorial negotiations with Berlin to clarify spheres of interest, from Finland to the Black Sea. Molotov traveled to Berlin in November 194, expecting to discuss long-term cooperation. Instead, he found Hitler rushing through meetings, clearly distracted. When Molotov asked about German troops entering Romania without consultation, Hitler brushed it off as precaution against British intrigue. Molotov pressed hard for recognition of Soviet claims to Bulgaria and the Turkish Straits. Hitler refused to commit. By the time the Soviet delegation returned home, they sensed the friendship had passed its peak. Back in Berlin, the Führer's staff recorded ominous memoranda, preparations for Eastern Campaign to begin. Codenamed Barbarossa, it was slated for the following summer. Stalin didn't know the details, but intelligence reports filtered in from agents in Prague and Stockholm describing German troop buildups along the frontier. He dismissed them as British provocations. After all, trains were still crossing the border daily, and oil still flowed to Germany. He couldn't imagine Hitler would risk those supplies mid-campaign. It was his greatest miscalculation. While suspicion simmered at the top, the bureaucracies beneath kept working as if nothing had changed. German engineers inspected Soviet mines for manganese quality. Soviet cargo clerks processed rail manifests labeled only by numbers. In one episode, a shipment of nickel ore bound for Germany was accidentally sent to Finland, then at war with the USSR. When Berlin complained, Moscow apologized and sent 2 trainloads as replacement. The unnatural civility persisted as armies quietly prepared to betray each other. Inside Soviet intelligence, a few analysts sounded warnings. They tracked German aerial mapping operations over Belarus and noted the sudden construction of fuel depots near the frontier. Reports went to Stalin's desk, but returned with scribbled notes, disinformation. He believed Hitler would never attack while still dependent on Soviet resources. It was the logic of a trader, not a strategist. Throughout early 1941, the flow of goods continued undisturbed. As the Wehrmacht assembled divisions covertly in Poland, Soviet trains delivered precisely the materials needed for invasion. Oil for vehicles, manganese for steel, grain for rations. One German official later remarked that the Russians were feeding the army destined to attack them. When German envoy Friedrich Schulenburg raised toasts with Molotov that may over the continuation of trade, German tanks were already being positioned against the same border where his trainloads crossed. To understand the scale of collaboration, consider the numbers. 90% of Germany's imported oil in 194 came from the USSR. Half its imported grain did too. In return, the Soviet Union received hundreds of industrial presses, precision lathes, and technical drawings worth billions in modern value. That exchange bound them economically, even as ideology and strategy were pulling them apart. June 1941, the pact had served its dual purpose. Stalin had reclaimed territory lost after World War and rearmed his military. Hitler had conquered most of Western Europe free from fear of the East. Now each claimed he'd been cleverer than the other. The final months of cooperation moved with grim efficiency right up until the eve of invasion. June 21, a day before Barbarossa, German ships were still loading manganese in Murmansk under Soviet supervision. 48 hours later, those materials would power the offensive against their supplier. Looking back, the Soviet-German friendship was the most calculated betrayal in modern history. Two regimes using each other as tools until usefulness expired. For Germany, it bought the resources to wage world war. For the Soviet Union, it bought time to survive it. Neither realized how brief their profit would be. Within a year, oil tankers that once carried fuel west would be burning in harbors bombed by the very airplanes their exports had built. The era of cooperation in the shadows was over. It would die in fire and steel on the morning of June 22, 1941. Denial and propaganda, the Soviet cover-up. When Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, propaganda across Moscow abruptly rewrote the last 2 years of history. Overnight, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact vanished from Soviet memory. But for decades before that, the Kremlin had worked tirelessly to keep its secret buried. What began as strategic deception in 1939 turned into one of the longest orchestrated cover-ups in modern politics. A campaign blending censorship, forgery, and intimidation, so complete that entire generations would question whether the secret protocols ever existed at all. The concealment began almost immediately after Poland's fall. Foreign correspondents stationed in Moscow started asking questions about Soviet troop movements mirroring Germany's advances. When a Finnish journalist asked if a pre-arranged boundary had been agreed upon, the Soviet press office dismissed him, claiming Polish collapse had created coincidental overlap. To reinforce the lie, Pravda published editorials praising Soviet neutrality and condemning Western warmongers spreading false allegations. Every article followed an identical script. There were no secret clauses, only capitalist slander. 2 years later, when Germany turned on its former partner, Stalin's regime needed an even stronger defense. The official narrative recast the 1939 pact as a brilliant defensive maneuver that had delayed Germany's attack. The secret protocol, by then widely discussed in Western capitals, was branded a propaganda invention. Soviet citizens never heard the words Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were told only of the 1939 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. In Soviet textbooks, it appeared as a prudent act of diplomacy that kept war away from Soviet borders. Behind those public statements was a machine of falsification unrivaled in scope. The Soviet Foreign Ministry maintained an entire department dedicated to documentary countermeasures. Their job was to rewrite diplomatic files, purge references to secret negotiations, and create sanitized paper trails for internal archives. Copies of telegrams to Berlin were burned. Substitute versions left out entire paragraphs. The genuine protocol locked in Stalin's private archive under the title Osobo Papkano. One was known only to a handful of men who carried the secret to their grave. When interrogated decades later, surviving officials would recall only the code name, never the contents. Western intelligence agencies, however, obtained fragments of the truth within weeks of the invasion. Among documents captured from retreating German units in 1945 were microfilmed copies of the German-Soviet agreements. These recordings showed the precise lines of division across Poland and the Baltics. Washington and London made the details public almost immediately, concluding that both dictators had colluded in partitioning Eastern Europe. Moscow responded with fury. The Soviet Information Bureau issued an emphatic denial. No secret agreements have ever existed between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and any foreign power. To reinforce this denial, the Kremlin released a notorious pamphlet in 1948 titled Falsificators of History. Written under Stalin's supervision, it presented a counter-narrative portraying the USSR as an innocent peace seeker forced into compromise after Western betrayal at Munich. It accused the Americans of forging German documents to defame the Soviet Union. Every Soviet school and university received copies. In some chapters, names of actual signatories were erased or replaced with vague terms such as representatives of the German government. The tone mixed outrage with wounded pride, insisting that Stalin's only aim in 1939 was to preserve the peace of Europe and defend the working people. For Soviet citizens, even questioning that story meant danger. In the late 194s, academics who cited Western publications discussing the secret protocol were arrested or silenced. University historians were required to describe the pact as a tactical step that exposed Western duplicity. Teachers caught using pre-war maps showing independent Baltic states risked dismissal. Archives remained sealed under the highest classification, and references to Poland's dual invasion were reduced to one line in censored encyclopedias. In 1939, Western Ukraine and Western Belarus were liberated from Polish landlords. During the Cold War, this falsification hardened into doctrine. Every attempt by Western historians to revisit the pact was dismissed by Soviet institutions as anti-Soviet provocation. When West German publishers printed the captured protocol in 1948, Soviet media dismissed it as counterfeit forged by imperialist intelligence. The strategy worked inside the Iron Curtain, where scarcity of alternate information left few who could challenge it. Even among loyal communists abroad, belief in the Soviet narrative persisted. Many Western left-wing intellectuals could not reconcile Moscow's role in dividing Poland with their faith in the socialist project, so they accepted the denial as truth. Inside the Kremlin, though, memory refused to vanish. Senior diplomats privately acknowledged the existence of the protocol while outwardly defending the lie. In the 195s, under Khrushchev, small groups of historians petitioned for limited access to Stalin-era archives in hopes of clarifying diplomatic events. The requests were quietly declined. Official statements continued to cite falsificators of history as the final word, describing the pact as a move that unmasked Western imperialism. Even after Stalin's death, de-Stalinization avoided the topic entirely. It was considered too dangerous to Soviet legitimacy. Meanwhile, survivors in the Baltic states and occupied Poland kept their own records. Families preserved original government documents confiscated during 194's annexations, showing that Soviets had prepared occupation plans before Germany attacked. Underground historians circulated typewritten essays comparing those plans to the lines described in the German captured maps. Each samizdat edition was a form of rebellion. To possess one was criminal, but they passed them anyway, hidden in Bibles, folded inside false book covers, smuggled across borders by diplomats, families who fled. The tension between secret truth and official fiction deepened in 1979 during the 40th anniversary of the pact. Western broadcasters, such as Radio Liberty and the BBC, aired special programs recounting the documented evidence of the secret protocol. Inside the USSR, authorities answered with theatrical outrage. Newspapers accused Western media of attempting to resurrect the ghosts of fascism. At the same time, Soviet historians held panel discussions carefully scripted to praise Stalin's foresight in 1939, presenting the pact as a necessary step that prevented Hitler from reaching our borders sooner. The message was consistent. Whatever happened, it had saved the USSR. Still, cracks began to show. By the 198s, under the first signs of glasnost, younger Soviet researchers started hearing rumors that somewhere in the archives lay proof contradicting everything they'd been taught. A few journalists within Literaturnaya Gazeta and Moscow News began cautiously referencing the issue, asking why Soviet maps from 1939 and early 194 matched those published in Nazi files. Their questions triggered nervous censorship, articles recalled before printing or pages ripped from subscriber copies. But the momentum of curiosity was unstoppable. In 1989, the lid finally lifted. As communist control waned, demands for openness grew irresistible. A commission headed by reformist politician Alexander Yakovlev was formed to investigate long-standing historical anomalies. Its findings confirmed what decades of denials had hidden. The secret protocols were real, signed, and implemented exactly as Western historians had described. The revelation devastated those who had built their careers on the Soviet narrative. For the first time, state television admitted that Stalin had joined Hitler in dividing Eastern Europe. Citizens watched in stunned silence as the myth dissolved on screen. But that reckoning still lay ahead. For half a century before it, Soviet propaganda had managed the impossible, turning documented conquest into an act of victimhood. The cover-up wasn't just the suppression of a document, it was the construction of an identity. The USSR portrayed itself as the eternal anti-fascist power, conveniently forgetting that in 1939 it had marched beside the very regime it later destroyed. By controlling archives, language, and memory, the Soviet Union ensured that history itself became another front line. Every forged map, every deleted paragraph, every silenced scholar served the same purpose: to shield an empire from its own reflection. When the truth finally emerged in the twilight years of the Soviet state, it didn't just expose a 1939 deception. It revealed the price of half a century built on denial. The myth had protected the system for generations. The moment it fell, so did the system itself. The revelation, declassification, and reckoning. It's 1989 in Moscow, and inside a high-ceilinged meeting room of the Supreme Soviet, TV cameras hum quietly. Papers shuffle. The man standing at the podium, Alexander Yakovlev, a key reformer under Gorbachev, has just uttered words that hang in the air like gunpowder. Yes, comrades, a secret protocol existed. For half a century, Soviet citizens were told that Western accusations about a hidden clause in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were capitalist lies. Now the facade is cracking. Viewers watching on state television stare in disbelief. In that single moment, the official history of the war collapses. The investigation didn't appear from nowhere. In the late 198s, under the swelling current of glasnost, archives began to loosen, and buried truths started surfacing. Baltic activists, emboldened by reform, demanded clarification about the 1939 partition of their states. Historians inside Lithuania and Estonia risked their careers producing parallel reports comparing old Soviet boundary maps with those published in Nazi archives. The lines were unmistakable, identical down to individual rivers. Pressure built until the government could no longer pretend not to notice. Gorbachev, hoping to preserve credibility abroad, authorized a special commission to examine the historical circumstances of the 1939 Soviet-German agreements. Behind closed doors, the inquiry sifted through decades of falsified records. In a dusty file vault of the Foreign Ministry, clerks unearthed a folder marked Osobaya Papka No. 34. Inside lay carbon copies stamped Top Secret, bearing signatures unmistakably belonging to Molotov and Ribbentrop. What had long been rumored was now undeniable. Stalin's government had indeed approved a hidden annex dividing Eastern Europe into zones of influence. The wording matched the German version captured in 1945, almost sentence for sentence. On December 24, 1989, the finding reached the floor of the Congress of People's Deputies. Some members argued even then that revealing this truth would damage the Soviet Union's moral standing. Others insisted silence was no longer possible. Yakovlev stood calmly and read the commission's conclusion aloud. The room, filled with communist veterans trained to believe Stalin infallible, fell silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens. Officially, the Congress condemned the secret protocols as an act of personal power, contrary to the will of the Soviet people. The words were carefully chosen, separating the late dictator from the state itself, but the damage was irreversible. For the first time, Moscow admitted complicity in Hitler's aggression. The world's reaction was instantaneous. Across Poland and the Baltic states, church bells rang and crowds gathered in public squares, holding banners that read, "Truth has returned." Newspapers in Riga and Vilnius published the original boundary maps side by side, with newly released Soviet photos showing Molotov signing beneath the Kremlin's chandeliers. For survivors of deportations, it was the vindication of a lifetime. "We were told our parents lied," one Latvian teacher said to reporters. "Now we know who really did." But not everyone rejoiced. Within weeks, conservative officials attempted to downplay the admission. Commentators sympathetic to the old guard claimed the secret protocols were a strategic necessity, a way for the USSR to delay war. They recycled Stalin's old argument that the West had abandoned collective security at Munich and left Moscow no choice. In military academies, instructors struggled to adjust lesson plans written under the previous narrative. A few simply ignored the revelation, pretending the news hadn't happened. Yet students found copies of the documents reprinted in foreign journals. Debates spread across campuses faster than state censors could react. The decisive moment came a few years later, after the Soviet Union's collapse. In 1992, the newly formed Russian government opened part of the presidential archive to scholars. Among the first files displayed were the originals of both the pact and the secret protocols, complete with Stalin's handwritten notes in the margin and the wax seals of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Photographs of those pages were published in Izvestia and Nezavisomaya Gazeta. For anyone still doubting authenticity, the evidence was ink on paper, beyond denial. In 1993, historians compiled the full texts into an academic volume titled Novia I Novishaya Istoria, the first official USSR origin publication admitting the secret deals were real. It was the final confirmation of a truth hidden for 50 years. The emotional impact across the post-Soviet world was profound. Former Soviet republics used the revelation to reinforce their independence movements. Latvia and Estonia declared that annexation under the pact had been illegal from the start. Poland's leaders demanded acknowledgement of moral responsibility for the partition and ensuing massacres. German officials, who had already confessed their role decades earlier, sent copies of captured documents back to Moscow as symbolic restitution. This act closed a circle once defined by denial. Yet the reckoning didn't come without unease. Within Russia itself, public opinion split sharply. Some saw the confirmation as necessary cleansing, honesty as patriotism. Others viewed it as humiliation engineered by Western pressure. Television debates turned heated as veterans asked whether condemning Stalin's diplomacy meant also questioning the legitimacy of the wartime victory that followed. By facing one truth, the state risked unraveling an entire mythology of heroism. Academics rushed to interpret the newly available data. For the first time, detailed studies traced how the secret protocols dictated the timing of Germany's and the USSR's invasions, how Soviet forces occupied assigned territories almost to the kilometer, and how the subsequent deportations aligned with pre-war planning. The precision stunned researchers. What many had assumed spontaneous opportunism proved to be deliberate execution of clauses written in 1939. The moral language of post-war politics, liberation, socialist brotherhood, anti-fascist struggle, looked hollow against that evidence. By the late 199, the admission had transformed from revelation to political touchstone. Russian liberals cited it as proof that transparency could rebuild trust between nations. Nationalists recoiled, portraying it as an attack on national pride. State anniversaries of World War II now carried an undercurrent of unease. Every parade honoring victory had, in the background, an unspoken acknowledgement that the road to that triumph began in partnership with tyranny. Internationally, historians revised their perspectives too. Western narratives that once framed the USSR solely as a victim of Hitler began incorporating its role as initial enabler. The timeline of World War II broadened to show how totalitarian opportunism, not just fascist aggression, set the conflict in motion. Museums across Europe curated exhibits displaying the declassified maps alongside refugee testimonies. In Berlin, a copy of the protocol hung beside photographs of bombed Warsaw. In Riga, visitors could trace the Soviet annexation orders printed line by line from the same document once denied by an empire. For those who had spent lifetimes fighting the lie, vindication was bittersweet. The truth had surfaced, but decades of denial had already reshaped memory. Generations raised on state narratives struggled to reinterpret what it meant that their grandfathers' march to victory began with collusion. Television interviews from the era capture this moral dissonance perfectly. Veterans pausing mid-sentence, unsure whether to regret or defend. "We fought fascism," one said quietly, "but we began as its partner. What do we do with that?" Even after exposure, remnants of justification lingered. Some officials insisted that the pact delayed Nazi invasion long enough for the USSR to prepare. Others went further, claiming it was a calculated move that ultimately saved Europe. But archival minutes from the 1989 Commission contradicted them directly. Stalin's leadership had pursued territorial expansion, not defensive delay. The text left no ambiguity. Denial, once weaponized to maintain unity, could now only fracture it. In the end, the revelation reshaped not just historical understanding, but national identity. The Soviet Union collapsed within 2 years of its confession, leaving independent states defined in part by rejection of Stalinist myths. Russia inherited both the archives and the argument, torn between pride in victory and shame in its origins. The declassified files turned history into a mirror, forcing citizens to see both conqueror and collaborator reflected together. Decades after Yakovlev's quiet admission, the image still unsettles. Every year on August 23, candlelight vigils in Vilnius, Warsaw, and Tallinn commemorate the pact's victims. In Moscow, official ceremonies remain subdued, careful in language. The documents are displayed under glass in the state archive, a reminder that secrecy built empires, but truth dismantled one. The pages themselves are thin, creased, and almost ordinary, yet their weight shifted continents. With their release, Europe's hidden wound was finally named. The pact's ghost could no longer be denied. It had been stamped, catalogued, and read aloud for the world to hear. The legacy and modern controversy. When the Soviet Union dissolved, historians hoped the truth about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would finally rest in settled clarity. But 3 decades later, the argument still refuses to die. In Russia, new generations of leaders reinterpret the same document according to the political winds. Abroad, the memory of betrayal continues shaping diplomacy and distrust across Eastern Europe. The pact may belong to the archives, yet its shadow keeps moving with every shift of power. The tone of that debate changed dramatically in 2009. On the 70th anniversary of the pact, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin stood in front of the memorial in Gdansk, once the free city of Danzig, and publicly called the agreement immoral. For a moment, it seemed Russia was ready to confront its past. He laid flowers for Polish victims and said that there can be no justification for the partition of a neighbor. European media described it as a turning point, an acknowledgement that Moscow's moral reckoning had finally arrived. But that tone didn't last. 10 years later, at another anniversary, Putin's words took a sharp turn. In 2019, he called history more complicated than critics allowed. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he argued, was a necessary response to Western betrayal, an echo of the 1938 Munich Agreement where Britain and France surrendered Czechoslovakia to Hitler. What were we supposed to do? He asked rhetorically. The logic was familiar to Russian audiences. When the West isolates you, pragmatism replaces idealism. Overnight, textbooks and state media echoed the revised line. The pact had gone from shameful to strategic, from betrayal to necessity. This shift wasn't just political spin. It reflected a deeper struggle over identity. For Russia, World War II, the Great Patriotic War, remains the sacred cornerstone of national pride. To admit that the war began with collusion is to chip away at that foundation. Official commemorations prefer the story that begins in 1941, when the USSR became victim and liberator. The events of 1939-40 disrupt that narrative. So the state balances two incompatible truths. Stalin signed a deal with Hitler, yet the Soviet people defeated Nazism. To preserve unity, many choose to emphasize the latter and minimize the former. Revisionist voices inside Russia took that reasoning further. Historians associated with nationalist think tanks argued that Stalin had little choice. They described the pact as a forced maneuver that saved millions of Soviet lives by delaying war nearly 2 years. Some went even further, presenting it as a moral counterstroke, punishing Western hypocrisy after Munich state-aligned television began producing documentaries explaining how Western unwillingness to fight fascism left Russia to act alone. By reframing aggression as self-defense, they turned a diplomatic crime into a patriotic triumph. Across the borders in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those arguments landed like insults. For them, the pact wasn't a strategic buffer, it was the blueprint for occupation. Streets renamed after Soviet generals still cut through their capitals. Families can trace their own deportation lists back to territories marked in Stalin's handwriting. When Moscow's officials defend the pact, they see it as denial of their sovereignty and suffering. In 202, the European Parliament passed a resolution declaring that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact paved the way for the outbreak of World War II, placing equal responsibility on both totalitarian regimes. Russia's foreign ministry condemned it as historical revisionism, claiming Europe was trying to equate liberator and aggressor. The argument wasn't just about the past, it was a battle over moral ownership of victory. That fight over memory spills into modern geopolitics. When Russia frames the 1939 pact as self-protection, smaller states hear echoes of the same logic used to justify influence over their territory today. Baltic leaders emphasize remembrance days on every August 23, holding candlelight vigils and human chain ceremonies to mark the date of the signing. In their narrative, the pact stands as proof of what happens when great powers decide the fate of weak nations behind closed doors. Polish officials phrase it bluntly: "Our guarantee of freedom is remembering how easily we were traded once before." Inside academic circles, the debate remains just as contested. Russian military historians point to intelligence reports showing that the Red Army was unprepared in 1939 and claimed the pact gave Moscow vital time to rebuild its defenses. Western scholars counter with production data proving that Soviet rearmament continued under normal pace and that the real motivation was expansion, not survival. Newly digitized archives support their view. Orders for annexations in the Baltics and Bessarabia were drafted months before Germany attacked. Yet those details rarely surface in mainstream Russian media, where the emphasis stays on Hitler's betrayal rather than Stalin's complicity. Propaganda patterns from the Cold War still echo in subtle ways. School textbooks print maps beginning in 1941, skipping the joint invasion of Poland. Public museums in Moscow showcase photographs of liberation in 1945, but rarely display the joint parade at Brest-Litovsk from 1939. The omission doesn't erase the truth, but it softens it. Visitors leave believing that the Soviet Union emerged spotless into a dirty world. Meanwhile, independent Russian historians who challenge this narrative face funding cuts or legal obstacles. Researching the secret protocols has once again become politically sensitive, a sign that history in Russia remains current affairs. Outside Russia, interest in the pact revived during tensions between Moscow and its neighbors. Commentators drew parallels between Stalin's concept of security zones and modern arguments for buffer regions. Analysts in Warsaw pointed out that every generation seems to rediscover the danger of small states caught between larger imperialisms. The lessons taught by 1939 are restated continuously. When deterrence fails and diplomacy stalls, geography decides who survives. For Eastern Europe, remembering the pact isn't nostalgia, it's strategy. Even within Russia, not everyone accepts the official balancing act. Writers, filmmakers, and young historians have begun exploring the emotional dimension left untouched by state narratives. Their documentaries focus on the families deported after Soviet occupation, on letters from Polish officers executed at Katyn, on the quiet complicity of soldiers who believed they were securing peace. These projects rarely premiere on national television, but they circulate online, shared by viewers unwilling to let memory be managed. The result is a divided remembrance, official pride above ground, quiet confession below. The controversy also touches religion. The Russian Orthodox Church, a powerful voice in modern public life, tends to align with national sentiment, portraying the war as a test of collective faith and endurance. Yet some clergy have begun acknowledging the pact during memorial services for war victims, framing it as evidence of how moral compromise precedes catastrophe. Their sermons walk a delicate line, honoring Soviet sacrifice while recognizing the sin that preceded it. For congregants, that tension feels honest. It mirrors the nation's unresolved conscience. At the same time, Western societies wrestle with their own convenient memories. Many overlook that Britain and France's appeasement in 1938 pushed Stalin toward the deal. The lesson that deterrence requires unity still haunts modern alliances. The story of the pact reminds them that moral weakness invites pragmatism from the ruthless. When European leaders gather for modern security summits, the photographs of Stalin and Ribbentrop occasionally appear on slides about historic miscalculations. The ghosts of 1939 remain teachers, whether anyone welcomes them or not. What gives the ongoing argument its power is how directly it connects to current fears. Every side sees itself reflected in the story. Russians recall betrayal and isolation. Poles and Balts remember invasion and silence from the West. Western nations see the cost of hesitation. The pact serves as a mirror where everyone finds justification. That is why no agreement on interpretation will ever hold for long. Yet across all perspectives lies one unbroken thread. Secrecy breeds catastrophe. The secret protocols transform diplomacy into conspiracy, peace into a countdown. Today, as new alliances form and distrust rises, historians and soldiers alike cite the Molotov-Ribbentrop example as a warning. When nations trade honesty for expedience, borders turn into weapons. The legacy of that August night endures not as static history, but as an active language of politics. In classrooms, debates, and international conferences, the phrase spheres of influence still summons the same unease it carried in 1939. The pact's documents are yellow with age, but the mindset behind them, the belief that might can dictate geography, remains the flaw at the heart of global order. Every generation will return to those pages, not because they want to, but because the same temptation keeps repeating. The world may have declassified the secret, but it hasn't escaped its shadow. The pact's shadow over Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was more than a diplomatic miscalculation. It was a calculated crime dressed as diplomacy. In August 1939, two authoritarian empires performed a handshake that promised peace but delivered invasion. Their signatures didn't just redraw maps, they dictated the deaths of millions. Poland, the Baltics, Finland, Romania, each became testing grounds for expansion disguised as security. What began as ink on paper turned entire nations into statistics before the war had even officially begun. When those secret protocols surfaced decades later, Europe saw the pact clearly for what it was, the blueprint of destruction. The language of spheres of influence sounded sterile, but behind it were deportations, executions, and the silent dissolving of independence. Hitler needed confidence that he'd face no resistance in the East. Stalin needed time to rebuild the army he'd dismantled through purges. Their alliance, one fascist, one communist, wasn't ideological, it was transactional. Each thought he was outwitting the other, yet both ensured the continent's descent into total war. Britain and France learned the truth the hardest way. Their slow diplomacy and fractured resolve forced them to watch a neighbor's dismemberment they had sworn to prevent. The pact exposed appeasement's terminal flaw. You can't contain aggression by trusting opportunists. Within a month of the treaty, Europe's fragile order imploded. By signing his name, Stalin turned Hitler's gamble into certainty. The war that began in Poland spread like fire across borders drawn in secret. Even victory couldn't erase what that agreement unleashed. The Red Army's triumph in 1945 came at a price written 6 years earlier under Kremlin chandeliers. Every liberation followed tracks first laid by conquest. By the time Berlin fell, much of Eastern Europe had simply exchanged one occupier for another. The Allied victory map of 1945 still bore the faint outline of Stalin and Ribbentrop's 1939 lines, a haunting symmetry proving that empires never die cleanly. They mutate. When the documents were finally released in 1992, the facade of moral purity cracked forever. The narrative of the heroic Soviet defender had to coexist with evidence of its collaboration. Yet the acknowledgement didn't destroy the myth, it complicated it. Nations built entire identities on what they chose to forget. In Western classrooms, appeasement became the cautionary tale. In Russia, selective amnesia turned the pact into a necessary evil. History, it seemed, had divided itself as neatly as Stalin's map once did. Today, the pact's shadow still crosses Europe in subtler ways, in every argument about borders, influence, and security guarantees. Each time a leader claims territory for historical rights or justifies aggression as preemptive defense, the language echoes that August night. The names change, the logic does not. Modern wars begin the same way old ones did, through secret arrangements disguised as stability. The lesson is brutally simple. Transparency doesn't prevent conflict, but secrecy guarantees it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stands as the archetype of deceit in statecraft. It reminds the world that behind every polished communique can hide a line on a map destined to become a front line in reality. The people erased from those lines, farmers, teachers, soldiers, children, outnumber every diplomat who signed them. The irony of history is that the pact meant to secure both regimes instead destroyed them. Hitler's betrayal turned partner into enemy. Stalin's gamble cost tens of millions of Soviet lives. The empire that denied the truth for 50 years collapsed within months of admitting it. Power built on secrecy always rots from its center. And so the question lingers. What deals remain hidden in plain sight today? Which maps are quietly being redrawn while the world looks elsewhere? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact isn't just an old scandal buried by time. It's a template for how truth can be postponed, but never erased. Every archive unlocked, every file declassified, is another strike against the silence that once let dictators carve the world like property. The secret that doomed Europe belongs to the past, yet its warning belongs to every future. Because history doesn't repeat, it waits for those who stop paying attention. To the victims named and unnamed, the pact's lesson endures. Vigilance is the only safeguard against betrayal dressed as peace. For more untold wartime secrets and declassified histories, follow this channel and uncover the truths history tried to bury.